So a few years ago, Xi Jinping decided that he had a dream and that China had a dream. Basically, the leader of China appropriated the US national narrative about an American dream and created the China dream. Problem is, in 2021, Chinese workers, of all people, are the ones that aren't having it. And today, Chinese people are deciding to, quote, lay flat. So, what does this phrase mean? Where did it come from? And why did it end up becoming one of the most important themes or terms of 2021? So, let's see what's really going on here. The Chinese labor force of the last 30 years has accomplished amazing things. They're really unheard of. They built a whole civilization, a whole modern industrial state at a scale that no one had ever seen and no one really thought possible. But the problem is that generation is retiring and now it's their children's turn. But Chinese millennials and the later Zoomers are really having none of it. And there's a good reason why. The opportunities in China are just not what they once were. Chinese millennials in particular face an absolutely brutal labor market. They face saturated professions and limited income growth. And worst of all, the Chinese tech companies that used to be seen as the leading edge of a new China, as the frontier, as the sector and the industry and the companies and the workers that were bringing China into the future and creating vast wealth in the process, all of these companies are slowing down. And across the Chinese economy, it no longer feels like grand opportunities are just over the horizon. Even making ends meet, getting an apartment, and finding a spouse is ridiculously hard in China right now. And the Chinese labor force's response to this change, to this diminution of all their prospects and hopes and dreams really has just been to lie flat. And what lying flat means is basically doing the bare minimum. It means something that is very nihilistic and vaguely defeated. It's a posture that lacks enthusiasm or optimism or hope or belief in anything greater or more valuable that is worth putting all of someone's time into. It is for people who feel like they were fed false dreams and who are no longer willing to work to meet impossible goals. And this is not a small thing. This is a really deep malaise. And it should also sound familiar to people in the US or Europe. And a big reason that the lie flat movement, term, phrase, whatever you want to call it, has spread around China and really brought some fear into the heart of the Communist Party is because the economic system around the world is changing. And the big reason why is because economic growth is declining everywhere. And this trend started in Japan a long time ago before spreading to Europe and is now on its way to the United States and, of course, to China. Economic and demographic collapse hit Japan in the 90s. And the country, in a sense, really got to the future first. You know, for a while, everyone was just laughing at Japan. It had all these weird social pathologies that people used to really laugh at, basically, like all the hikikomori, the young male shut-ins, or people who had to rent friends for events, or people who just quite literally died alone on a mattress and nobody found them. All of this stuff sounded horrible, but now it doesn't seem so crazy or foreign. And in Europe, the long decline that we see now really got going during the 2008-2009 financial crisis and ensuing European debt crisis. Ever since then, Southern Europe has basically been on the ropes and hasn't been a functional economic and productive region. In Spain and Greece and Italy, life has not gotten better since the end of the financial crisis. And to the extent it has, it's really due to transfers and debt financing and things that can't be maintained and that will eventually have a really heavy price to pay for these countries and for the rest of Europe. And most of these places also have insane youth unemployment, very little growth, poor prospects, and whole populations that are giving up or have already given up entirely. The percentage of young people that live with their parents, percentage of young people that have jobs that are even staying in the country is really shocking and hard to deal with. And now COVID has made all of this worse. It's made it quite literally impossible to recover from. Americans who are waiting for things to get better in the United States have to realize that around the world, things most likely will not get better in a lot of countries because there's no longer any give, any slack in these systems. They were doing everything possible to keep a declining model from collapsing. And now it's really hit its breaking point in a lot of places. And what's really interesting in Europe is that Germany is about to get its comeuppance as well when its export model stalls, which is inevitable based on a lot of factors, including China, including the United States and what's happening in these countries. And then when that happens, the whole system that made it possible for Europe to limp along after 2008, 2009, 2010 really disappears. So China's lying flat phenomenon is mostly about the end of economic growth in China. People are talking about it in various philosophical or abstract or speculative ways about what it means in the culture and how it relates to this and how it relates to that. But the absolute basic, most fundamental truth is that it relates to the material fact of absolutely, objectively declining prospects within the Chinese economy. And this is particularly so in the major Chinese coastal export and industrial and urban zones. There's no lying flat phenomenon in all sorts of rural parts of China. That's not what people are talking about. It's really in the key dynamic sectors of the Chinese economy that really pushed forward, that had the most growth potential, but where even there, the investment levels, the actual investment levels that the economy could absorb have been hit. And what can be done after that is really technologically driven growth, which is dicey and is, like I said, stalling in China. And just to make clear what this broader phenomenon means globally, interest rates for something like 40% or more now of global national debt is negative, which basically means people see, or investors see, the future value of a lot of nations as declining or even being worthless. So the lying flat phenomenon or movement in China is the Chinese component of a global pattern of worker defeat and exhaustion, and in many ways of national exhaustion and a sense of defeat, where countries, whole countries, have not been able to recover from crises. And there's very big reasons and good reasons why this is happening. A big one being the demographic problems around the world, where it used to be that countries could recover, could move forward after all the booms and busts of history, when you had more people, more growth, more products, more inputs, more labor, all these things, all the inputs kept coming into the economy regardless of what else was happening. Now that is changing. In a place like Greece, the actual youth population is just fleeing the country, and it is left basically with old retirees, a really decrepit state sector, and absolutely no potential to grow. And if you look at the major capital city of Greece, Athens, it has been basically in a depression outside of its small tourist regions for over a decade, and not a soul in Europe has a single idea about how that could change. And basically everyone, whether they admit it or not, has actually just given up on that entire country. So the big difference in China is that China has run so far, so fast with its economic growth, that really few people are prepared in that country for what it means when it slows. And the Chinese Communist Party has done everything possible to keep the gravy train rolling. And that has great benefits in the near term and while people were really pushing forward. But when things stall or stop, it comes to a screeching halt. And workers in particular, who were sold a China dream and who were sold this sense that China would become the greatest, largest, most powerful nation in the world, and that it would do so again, and this was its destiny and its history, and that the celestial kingdom was back on top where it belonged and where it had always been. It is a very, very tough reality to deal with what is actually happening in that country. And anyone who's hearing this, who's hearing about lying flat and what it means, and just the pain and anguish that a lot of Chinese cutting edge, college educated, STEM, lawyers, doctors, those sorts of workers are feeling, well, this should feel pretty familiar to Americans, where it's not as bad, not nearly as bad as what happened in Europe, but millennials in particular got slammed by the financial crisis and then by COVID, and many are just, quite honestly, burned out. Millennials also chose or were forced, based on the sort of corporate model that prevails in the United States, chose to pile themselves into very overpriced coastal cities that kept even those with very high incomes from feeling very far from wealthy. That's just the way it worked with the rents and all of the other cost inflation that you see in a place like New York or San Francisco. And then you also add in COVID, which knocks all the social opportunities out, and you have people who are insanely well educated, very optimistic, very generous and intrepid and all these things and everything you'd want in a worker, who are just sitting in a small room with a desk day after day, feeling completely like life and everything they're trying to do doesn't make any sense. And so we're seeing a massive shift in not even the location and the geography and the labor force, everything in the United States, as particularly millennials age out, start moving into the suburbs, basically get into that phase of life where you start having kids, you start moving into a different phase of life. That is a huge part, but also the underlying thing is that people are responding to what was seen as poor incentives, bad outcomes, everything and anything you want to call it, for the sort of mid to late 20s, early 30s period, where millennials, with all that optimism, didn't quite get what they expected. A lot of people were priced out of the insanely overpriced education system in the U.S., so it locked them out of high-income employment in many cases. Or alternatively, which may be even worse, a lot of people who went to all of these insanely overpriced educational institutions were also locked into ruinous debt and were often stuck in oversaturated and unfulfilling fields that they didn't really want to be in, but they were pushed, whether it was just because of the culture out of college, where there's only 5 or 6 things that it really felt like any smart, hardworking person could do. And you all end up in consulting and investment banking and law and medicine and tech. And those are sort of the only things that people felt were appropriate to do. That is rough. And if you go into a place like 4chan, you can find similar expressions of despair and anger and frustration and futility and everything else you're seeing alongside people on the Chinese internet who are talking about lying flat and how that is justice and that is the natural way of things, and everything else is blank, unrepentant suffering for things that don't matter, don't mean anything, don't add anything to your life. That is not too foreign for Americans. It's really everywhere too. I mean, if you go add COVID plus lockdowns plus everything else, it is a really bad stew. And in China in particular, it has been very bad. China has been going through rolling, consistent lockdowns. It has had very, very, very painful, oppressive, authoritarian control of the population in order to handle COVID, because as I've said in other videos, the Chinese Communist Party is wedded to its zero tolerance COVID strategy because it props up the party and because kind of they don't have much else to run on at this point. And unfortunately, the Chinese vaccine does not work at all against Omicron, or really it didn't work against Delta as well. So China's sort of stuck and whole cities are still being thrown into lockdown. So that is a really, really brutal part of this. And it's part of why 2021 was the year that Chinese people themselves began to wonder if all of this was worth it. And that is a scary, scary thing for the party. The Chinese Communist Party, of course. And the other part of this is that this isn't just COVID. This is also something the Communist Party has brought upon itself. So one thing that the party is doing to also maintain its control and legitimacy is pushing a very heavy crackdown on Chinese tech companies. So while China wants its citizens to pursue the Chinese dream and push China into the future, it also wants and needs and is desperate for far stronger control over all of its technology companies and over many, many industries. There is a tech crackdown going on in China. And it's a big reason why many of the most innovative and productive workers in China are giving up. It's also part of the reason why this is so terrible and ironic and also easy to foresee. I mean, tech was supposed to be the future. It really is the future. I mean, there's not really much else that is a future in most countries. I mean, this is why people in the United States go read tech news sites and follow everything that Apple is about to do, and Facebook and Google, because it actually feels like, in some sense, something is moving it into the future. But today, Chinese tech companies are cowed and their heads are bowed. They're trying to not get destroyed by the government. And many tech companies have been killed, and a lot are having their worst year or years in a generation. Tencent, Alibaba, Didi, and other tech companies, large and small, have been getting slammed. Some have lost 30%. Many have lost over 50% of their value. It's just been, they've been getting decimated in the stock market, which is very important, because this means that China has really killed, or is in the process of killing, the last remaining area of spirit and innovation in the economy. And this isn't unique to China. It would be something similar to what would happen if the United States government basically decided to destroy Silicon Valley. Forget what you believe or think about all the billionaires and all the tech lords and gurus. It would probably suddenly feel like the country was not on its way to being anything better. If that main source of technological innovation that gave us Zoom, that gave us all the things that, as terrible as COVID was, that actually made this horrible experience bearable, if all that disappeared, it would probably feel like everything had completely stalled. And that's something a lot of people feel already with technology, and they very well could be correct and not wrong. And if crypto ends up collapsing, that might actually feel like the nail in the coffin for Silicon Valley in a lot of ways, because so many prominent venture capitalists and other people involved have really staked their everything on crypto technology. So we'll see how that goes. But this idea that you could hit your most innovative, most important industry, even psychologically in a sense, the country, the industry that makes China feel like it's pushing into the future, and have no back-end consequences for all the workers that we're trying to make things happen in that industry. It's really very tough. And what China is trying to do with this technology crackdown, which I've spoken about in other live streams, is basically to reorient the Chinese economy and the technology sector, technology writ large, not just technology in the sense of communication technologies, internet technologies, IT stuff, but technology writ large, all broadly, whether it's nuclear, marine technologies, aerospace, space, all that. It is trying to reorient Chinese advanced sectors to creating the technologies that allow China to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and able to stand on its own 2 feet. At this point, the Chinese government does not believe that the random consumer technologies and microblogs and all the other stuff that the Tencents and Alibabas, the equivalents of Google and Apple and Microsoft, what these companies do in China is no longer seen as the cutting edge or the most important technological field in the eyes of the Communist Party. And it's not exactly wrong, but what do? It's a tough pill for all the workers and everyone else to swallow who really do believe that that is where real innovation happens at a speed that makes the country and the people feel like something new is on the horizon, something better is there, and it's worth getting up and working for it and not just laying in bed. This is really pushing many Chinese people to just simply lie flat instead of going out there and trying to make the Chinese dream a reality. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you check out more. But if you want to learn more about China and the US and the world, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. And if you enjoyed this particular episode, please like it so more people can see it. And as always, comment or message me with any questions or thoughts you may have. And with that,